Welcome back, everybody, to the new polis. This is Critical Conversation number 8. I have a few housekeeping things to say before we get going here. So first, please keep yourself muted while people are talking until we get into Q&A session. And then happily, we will be having a whole conference next month in lieu of a critical conversation, which we're indebted to the critical conversations and to all of you who participate, because many of you have been contributing to the conference. It's going to go at least April 14th and 15th. Maybe into the 16th at this point, but we've just closed the submissions for it, and the conference is on decoloniality and the disintegration of Western cognitive empire. And many contributors to the new polis will be participating as well, as Walter Mignolo, for example, who was a critical conversationalist in January. Tink Tinker, who's been in a couple of critical conversations. There's going to be quite a bit of tension between sort of the local American Indian or North American, I know in Canada it's First Nations community, and then global conversation all from continents all around the world around the concept of decoloniality, which is Mignolo's kind of concept. Also, Mignolo's writing partner, Catherine Walsh, will be participating as well. So if you are into it or you're interested, you might check out their book Decoloniality, and that will be definitely a big part of the conference next month. I think Glenn Morris will be there as well. So without
Hey, Roger, before you go, I forgot to put in the disclaimer. So yeah. I have to do this for legal reasons. We are recording this critical conversation now, and it will be posted on the web. So we legally, we are assuming anybody who is taking part in this, even if they're just a spectator, is giving their consent to be recorded and to have our critical conversation posted. If you don't want that to happen, then please, you need to disconnect now. But anyway, that's just the legal reason. We're happy to have you here, and go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Carl. Yeah, and then the final thing that we always want to say is that we're always inviting submissions from you to continue these critical conversations in an ongoing sense, and you do not have to be an academic or have any kind of credentials to be participating. That's often a worry that I hear from people who've been an audience member here, or who I talk to on the street. They're like, well, can I come, or can I ask a question if I don't have a PhD? And the answer is always yes. This is a project to bridge the kinds of divides between the so-called ivory tower, which I don't like that term anyway, but and just people talking about critical issues today. So without further ado, today's conversation is on theory in action, or the art of doing theory, with Jonathan Fardy, who has his most recent book, I think that's been published anyway, is Althusser and Art. And that's not going to be the center of discussion necessarily today. It's really about doing the art of doing theory, but it will probably come up. It's a very short book if you haven't read it. It's very readable, which we're thankful for. And here's a little bit about our presenters, and I'll let them get started. So Jonathan Fardy is an assistant professor of art history and director of graduate studies in art at Idaho State University. His research examines the intersections between art theory and aesthetic practice. He's the author of Althusser and Art, Larwell and Non-Photography, Larwell and Art, The Aesthetic of Non-Philosophy. His forthcoming book, due out later this year, is The Real is Radical, Marx After Larwell. Our next presenter is going to be Andrew Weiss, who is an editor of Philosopher and Musician, As lead editor of Black and White Editing, he uses clarity and precision to empower academic writers in their work. He holds an MA in Theory and Criticism from Western University. His thesis, titled Animal Justice Following Derrida and Other Animals, explores the intertwining of animality and justice, developing associated concepts to clarify and deepen these terms. Andrew's philosophical work is now being developed as a project of music and writing called Animal, Vegetable, Mineral, using meditative music and philosophy to inspire awe and wonder for the universe and our place in it. Our third presenter will be Curtis Allen, or M. Curtis Allen, who is an interdisciplinary theorist with an arts background whose research draws together threads from philosophy of language and mind, aesthetics and art theory, and political economy. He teaches aesthetics and art history at OCAD, on NCAD universities in Canada, and I don't know what those acronyms stand for, so you might tell us. And then he's currently completing doctoral work in the Center of Study of Theory and Criticism at Western University under the title Sense and Genesis, the Metaphysics of Modernism and Aesthetics of Reason, elaborating the concept of sense in Wittgenstein and Deleuze, as it connects with recent problems across the theoretical humanities. He is also interested in contemporary forms of rationalism and their relation to art and politics. We'll let Jonathan, who's also my friend from the School of Criticism and Theory at Cornell way back in 2011, so I really appreciate having him and being able to see your face again. So thanks for being here, Jonathan.
Well, thank you so much, Roger and Coral. And thank you to the whole staff at the New Polis. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to do this. And I want to say a special thank you to Curtis and Andrew, old friends and colleagues from Theory Center days. And I think that I want to keep this conversational in the spirit of critical conversations. And I also want to respond to the prompt to really think about not just Althusser, but to think about theory and what that might be, what its effects might be, how might it constitute a kind of practice, and what its aesthetic and political effects might be. And so Althusser will be a sort of lens onto that larger set of questions. I want to also think about this in some measure through a kind of biographical or autobiographical perspective. The question of what theory could be or has been as much a personal as a professional question for me. Roger mentioned the fact that we met in 2011 at a thing called the School of Criticism and Theory, which was a summer camp for nerds, basically. But at the same time, as I had the pleasure of doing that, I was also enrolled as a PhD student at the Center for Theory and Criticism. So one place was the School of Criticism and Theory, the other place was the Center for Theory and Criticism. And so these terms, theory and criticism, have sort of haunted my personal and professional development. And so I want to sort of dial into my sort of encounter with this term, and then expand out from that to touch on some of the questions and ideas in this book. And I also want to say that I'm really appreciative to the New Polis and the work that they're doing. I think that one of the things also theory always means, at least for me, is that it is collective. It is, as Deleuze would say, a kind of collective assemblage of enunciation. It's the bringing together of voices and bodies and material processes. So in my experience and in my understanding of theory, we owe as much credit to those who think those ideas as those who've translated them, published them, the bookbinding, the distribution, the whole apparatus of theory's production is of interest to me. Okay. When I entered the Center for the Study of Theory and Criticism back in 2009, I really wondered what I'd entered. What did it mean to be studying theory? And there's a sentence that sort of was on my mind way back then and has never really left me. And this is not from Althusser, but from Homi Bhabha. And this is from his landmark essay, The Commitment to Theory from the Location of Culture. And this is just one sentence. I'm not going to read a ton to you, but I just want to read this one sentence. This is, he writes, Baba writes, in what hybrid forms may a politics of the theoretical statement emerge? And this is, I think, what's key. What tensions and ambivalences mark this enigmatic place from which theory speaks? And so for me, that was both a personal and professional kind of prompt. What does it mean to practice theory? It seems to be so enigmatic at times, but it also seems to be an emergent practice, something that emerges out of the intersections of a variety of disciplines and modes of practice. So for me, theory has always been a kind of interdisciplinary practice. It shows up in religious studies and English and philosophy and so forth. But I think the very idea of theory itself is itself kind of ambivalent, or in an interdisciplinary sense, ambivalent. It arose out of itself, out of the intersection of things like philosophy and politics, ethics, and disinterested study. So I'm kind of interested in the way that theory is a sort of ambivalent term, and that might be both what makes it vexing and what makes it have a kind of political potential. Okay. When I was at the Theory Center, one of the first books I picked up, mostly because I wanted to get a sense of why I had chosen to study this, was I went to the library and a book jumped out at me just because of the title of it. And the title on the spine was The Detour of Theory. And at that particular moment in my life, I certainly felt like I had taken a detour into theory. And the book, is, you might know, is actually a book about Althusser. And so that was really my introduction in a deep sense to Althusser, was through this book by Gregory Elliott called The Detour of Theory. And in this book, what I was introduced to was Althusser, but also introduced to something that was crucial for Althusser's own work, which then I subsequently started to read. One of the things Althusser was consistently concerned with was precisely what theory is or was. And although Althusser's work changed dramatically over the decades he wrote, with probably the most significant early work being in 1965 with the publication of the collected volume that he wrote with his students, Reading Capital, and then his own set of essays for Marx, 1965, a middle period that's marked by texts like Lenin and Philosophy, in which he took a more openly political orientation within philosophy, and then the late work that was really not published until after his death, which deals with issues of contingency. In each of these phases, Althusser's definition, or as he would put it, his theory of theoretical practice, changed dramatically. But what's interesting to me is that he was always concerned with what theory was, what its role might be, especially in relation to politics and political practice. But his answer to what theory was and its relationship to political practice did change quite dramatically over that time. So I don't want to go too deep into the weeds of this, but I think it's just worth just sketching very quickly those three phases, those three answers he gave. In the 1965 period, Althusser effectively said that theory was the business of philosophers, and the principal aim of it is to make a distinction between what he called science and ideology, by which he simply meant something, sort of, to put it simply, something like the difference between truth and false ideas about the world, true ideas about the world and false ideas about the world. In the middle period, in texts like Lenin and Philosophy, he took again a much more openly politically committed orientation. He said there various formulations, but one quite important one he said was that philosophy was class struggle in theory. And in this period of work, in the late 60s into the 70s, he refuses to think that philosophy or theory is some disinterested space of reflection or decision-making, but rather is an openly political form of engagement, that the duty of a philosopher is to combat ideologies that are inimical to, in his view, inimical to the emancipation of, for him, the working class, but oppressed people more generally. And then the third period, his theory of theoretical practice, and I think it's important to always bear in mind that for him, that formulation, theory of theoretical practice, he always believed that theory is a practice. In the third period, the practice is, the theory of theoretical practice is a theory that tries to think through the relationship between something like structure and contingency. Now, my interest in this short little book I wrote for, that was published by Zer0 Books, is really focused on the first two periods, the period of the 65 of reading Capital and for Marx, and then the middle period, most especially the collected essays in Lenin and philosophy. One thing I want to stress, and this will, I think, help to open this question of theory up, is that for Althusser, again, theory in all of these phases is always conceived as practice, and even more, I guess, interestingly, conceived as a productive practice. He insisted, and this was clear throughout his career, he always insisted that theory was not a form of reflection. He once put it, it's not about sifting gold from dross. Theory for him isn't about looking at the world and then picking out the truth of the world. Philosophy or theory for Althusser is about production, it's producing concepts that make the world thinkable and certain elements within it resistible. So it's not reflective, but productive. What interested me in this book, however, was the way he distinguishes the productive quality of theory from the way he characterizes art. He wrote 3 major texts on art, one in For Marx in 1965 on the theater of the Italian playwright Carlo Bertolazzi. And then he wrote a wonderful essay on the Italian painter Leonardo Cremonini, and that's in Lenin and Philosophy. And in that same volume, there's an essay simply called A Letter on Art. And although these essays look at different aspects of art and its relationship to society and politics, it seemed to me that the thing that links them is this idea that whether it's the theatrical arts or the visual arts or what have you, all art for Althusser has the power to reflect society and its problems, its ideologies. But he claims it cannot produce a knowledge of society, of ideology. And so here I'll just read one very brief quote from Althusser to make this point clear. And this is from the Letter on Art, published in Lenin and Philosophy. He writes that art makes us see, and therefore gives to know in the form of seeing, perceiving and feeling. And then in parentheses he says, which is not the form of knowing. So art is something that can make us see in the broadest sense. It can make things visible for us. It can make us feel things, but that cannot be equated with knowing. And for him, knowing is the process or the production of theory. Theory produces knowledge. Art lets us see what's already there, which is to say it reflects it. And it's this specific distinction, theory as productive of knowledge, art as reflective of the world, that in some measure I tried to challenge in this book. In part because, and I thought there was 2 ways to do this. One way was to say, well, art really is theoretical, it has critical and philosophical elements. But I thought a more interesting approach was actually to argue that within Althusser, but also maybe within theory more broadly, there is always, in my view, always an aesthetic dimension. There's always the problem of framing your thought, of staging your thought, of constructing a rhetoric to house that thought. And it seemed to me that that kind of work could also be described as the work of aesthetics. So last quote that I'll read, this is from Reading Capital, and this gives you a little bit of the flavor of what I mean. The 2 pages from Reading Capital that always have captivated me the most is pages 24 and 25, and they're from Althusser's introduction to the volume. In these pages, Althusser makes this interesting claim that theory, he says, is a form of visibility. And I'll just read part of this. He says, what exists in the field defined by a theoretical problematic, what exists in a field of theory, a field of inquiry, is a set of objects. And he says this is a field of visibility which sees, that means the field of visibility of theory itself, sees itself in the objects or problems it defines. And he continues throughout these 2 pages talking about theory as a form of visibility, that theory is a kind of frame that makes a set of problems or a set of issues visible. And it seemed to me that one could say precisely the same thing about aesthetic work. Precisely to take his own words from a letter on art, is if art is what makes us see, how in some formal sense is that different than theory being the work of making things visible? And so it was this challenge I wanted to sort of mount to push back on his distinction that art merely reflects and makes us see, whereas theory gives us knowledge. If in fact, as he claims in the introduction to Reading Capital, theory precisely is the production of the visible. Okay, just a couple more things, and then I'm going to turn it over to my respondents. I also want to talk about, I think, a lacuna in this book, and the lacuna might be precisely the concept of the aesthetic itself. A friendly critic pointed out to me recently that this concept of the aesthetic seems to be a problematic one to apply to Althusser precisely because Althusser was famously an anti-humanist in theory. He did not want to countenance an idea that would reconstruct or reinvigorate a certain concept of man, the human, which seems to be so much at the center of how we've understood aesthetics in the Western tradition. That for there to be a perceptible, there has to be a perceiver, etc. And so is there then a way, and this is an open question to myself, is there a way to reconceive this aesthetic dimension in theory in anti-humanist terms? Can I think about, or can we think about the aesthetic dimension of Althusser's work, or by extension, the aesthetic dimension of any theoretical orientation or theoretical frame without, by default, reinvigorating concepts like man, subject, human. I want to somehow be faithful to that anti-humanist perspective in Althusser, and yet push back against, and I'll conclude with this, what I see as the division of labor in Althusser. Artists reflect the world, but theorists tell us what the world is about. And I think that that division of labor is something I like to challenge with you here today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just gonna pop over my PowerPoint here really quick. Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me to respond here. I'm actually quite compelled by your book, and I really enjoy the fact that you're looking to not only show the aesthetic dimension of theory, but also like credit aesthetics on both sides of that. So I've made a little PowerPoint just because I'm going to quote you a few times. And I find as a visual person, I really like to see the words on the page. And I hope that would sort of facilitate some engagement, especially from, I'm assuming a lot of folks maybe here haven't had the chance to read your book just yet. So while I am going to touch on some topics from your book, I want to see this very much as like a springboard to a discussion that you know, kind of goes beyond just the book itself to include anything that anyone else might want to say. So, so yeah, I have two questions. that I'll sort of outline very briefly, and then I'll kind of unpack them a little bit. And the first question is sort of, who is the we who kind of is addressed in your book? And I think this is a pretty interesting question that you make a sort of call that we need to return to Althusser, and I'll show a little more at length kind of what you say there to bring everyone up to speed. But I thought that would be kind of an interesting question to ask here. You know, we can also ask, we in the Zoom call, let's say, can ask who we are and what kind of assemblage we're forming here. And sort of what does that mean, and how can we sort of dig into that and think a little bit more about how that operates? The second question I'm going to ask is sort of like, you know, okay, theory has an aesthetic form. That's an amazing insight. I think it's an extremely important one. I think it's almost never talked about in philosophy or theory, and yet it shapes everything we do, the decisions that we make in writing, and all sorts of things that I'll try to get into. But so now what? You know, how can we think about theory's aesthetic form in greater detail? And so what I'm going to do is I have a sort of list of some concepts I thought might be interesting to kind of spark a discussion, or I'm thinking almost as like a packet of seeds, and I'm going to toss out a bunch of stuff, and I'll sort of see what sprouts a little bit. And Jonathan, if there's any of these in particular that you think are interesting, then I'd love to hear from them, or hear about them. And same for Curtis, and same for anybody else in the discussion that follows later. So near the end of the book, you have this comment that we need to return to Althusser as Althusser returned to Marx. I'm sort of curious about how you envision that, and to kind of keep pulling that thread in the book, I'm gonna read this. This is actually the last line of the book, and you say, we need to return to Althusser as Althusser returned to Marx, which is to say that we need to return to Althusser's work and to its legacy to listen to what it says in its silence and what it stages and frames as absence, namely the symptomatic question: what form must theory take that will not metacritically reproduce the ideological division of labor against which all thought worthy of the name Marxist must continue to struggle against? And so you nicely just recapitulated this distinction that you find in Althusser, which is the distinction between art on the one hand as political production or a knowing. And so you're saying quite nicely here at the end of the book that we must envision a form of theory that would undermine this sort of division. So I think that's very interesting to discuss as well. But I thought maybe this would be a nice point to hand it over to you, and you know, kind of invite you to think about who this we is and how you envision that. And I think I'll get into the second question after we've had a chance to bounce that around. Does that sound good?
Yeah, just to clear with Roger, should I respond to Andrew and then go to Curtis? Okay. Yeah, so thank you so much, Andrew, for these thoughts. As always, they're stimulating and interestingly difficult. I especially like this question about what forms, if we take seriously the aesthetic dimension of theory, of theoretical production, the construction of words, of phrases, of slogans, etc., then what form can interestingly undermine that division of labor that I think that actually the New Polis really wants to do, which is to undermine, to get this division of labor, like, oh, if you don't have a PhD, you can't speak to this. If you're not an academic, you can't speak to that. I think that is incredibly limiting. In theory, unfortunately, has often been presented as a very elite discourse. And if you haven't gone through the proper training, you can't speak to it. And I think that what I hope is that we can at least begin to think about theory as an aesthetic practice, which might then be open to anybody who's interested in making things visible, of speaking in the most broadest sense about making sensible our political lives. And that if that in some measure means what it means to do theory, I'm all on board. Now, the forms that it might take, that more democratic notion of theoretical production, as open to, and I think in the background, it's Jacques Rancière, the idea of a kind of community of the sensible, which is unevenly distributed. But nonetheless, the question is, can we then look to forms that would continue to open up theory in a much more democratic way that's much more open to more people and more voices? And I think I don't have a direct answer for what forms that might take. I think what I want to say is that we at least should be open that there might already be forms of knowledge production right now that are taking place in universities, outside universities, in coffee shops and concert halls, that might not get called theory, but might actually be doing a kind of theoretical work. So I think partly what I would say is we need to be open, listening carefully, that there might be theoretical resources being produced in sites and in ways and in forms that we're not accustomed to calling theory. And that's, I'd say, I would want to say, I don't have any prescription for how we should do it, but at least be attentive that it might be being done already and we're not aware of it because our training has kind of blinded us from it.
Yeah, I really like that. I think that's excellent. Yeah, I hadn't considered that, how sort of embracing this aesthetic dimension might give us some clues as to how to approach theory. I sort of imagine this image came to mind of like an art gallery where kind of anybody can walk in the door, and they might not necessarily know what to make of certain works of art or what to do about them, but sort of anyone can stand in that white room and engage a work of art. And so there's nobody checks at the door to make sure your papers are in order at the AGO. It's like you can just pay the admission and come in. Unlike sort of some of the gatekeeping practices that you nicely alluded to there, where people seem to say like, oh well, you're not trained in this, or you don't have a PhD in this field, or so we don't want your opinion. But yeah, I sort of want to say, to help give permission to any of the audience members, I also don't have a PhD, so I'm welcome to ask a question here, and you're just as welcome to ask a question as I am. So thank you, Jonathan. Okay, I'm going to dip back into the PowerPoint here and try to unpack a little bit of this sort of aesthetic form of theory, or as I imagine it to be. And I sort of have this list. I'll ask for a little bit of patience and restraint, because I feel like I'm gonna dig into some really fascinating stuff, but then kind of move very quickly through it. But I would really love it if anyone who has an idea that's like sparked by any of these brief components, these sort of concepts, to write it down and bring it up at any time. I really would love to dig into this stuff. And part of what I had in mind in throwing out so many ideas was the hope that there will be people in the audience who maybe will find their thinking sparked by some of this stuff, or they might have a kind of well-developed thought or kind of intense curiosity about one component or another, and we can kind of try to dig into that stuff. So actually, sorry, before I get to that though, I'm gonna read a sort of lengthy bit from your book, Jonathan, where I was really thrilled. I really found it electrifying, where you really like touch on this topic, and you start to kind of like open up this area of inquiry. And I just got so excited that I thought, oh yeah, there's got to be more things that we can say here, more ideas. So just to kind of bring everybody up to speed here, I'm going to read this bit from page 54 of Althusser and Art. What Althusser never seemed to consider, despite his interest in art, is that theoretical writing is a matter of writing, and as such involves the aesthetics of writing, from the force of polemics to the patient tone of the philosopher working through a problematic. Where is the line to be drawn between the manifesto and the critical essay, if not through the contested space of the aesthetic? Aesthetics is a tradition for dividing types of writing, types of speech, types of signs, types of images, types of performance. It is the intellectual practice of making distinctions between practices so as to identify and single out those practices which culture is supposed to appreciate. So I really like this sort of force of the polemics to the patient tone of the philosopher, and that was kind of one of the major things that got my wheels turning here. And so, so I'm just going to kind of give this list of some possible aspects of theory's aesthetic form, see how people kind of think about that. So I thought sometimes the thesis is operative. It could be a very declarative kind of aspect. It could be quite obscure and hidden. Similarly, we make arguments often in theory, sometimes very directly, sometimes they're more implied. There's an aspect that we might call textual evidence or citation. And that can range from, on the one hand, quite brief quotations to very lengthy block quotes. We could sometimes write a monograph on a single philosopher, or sometimes we consult very many sources. And it can also range, I think, from direct quotation to more implied influence, or maybe a kind of borrowing of terms, things like that, which sort of brings me to this next one, which is vocabulary. And we could think of this ranging on the one hand from, let's say, conversational vocabulary to, on the other extreme, quite technical or specialized vocabulary. I sort of thought Alain de Botton, on the one hand, is like a very conversational, very accessible kind of thinker, and on the other extreme, we might have somebody like Heidegger, who is almost like learning a whole new language to try to read him. We also have something like tone, which you nicely mentioned in that block quote that I just read. And on the one hand, we might think of something aggressive and polemical, maybe a Rancière or a Badiou. On the other hand, maybe more curious or generous. I think somebody like Heidegger here, who once taught a whole seminar on Plato's Allegory of the Cave, which is about a paragraph in length. So anyway, sentence structure is also an aspect that I think operates theoretically. We have on the one hand maybe something very straightforward, like Nietzsche can be sharper and more declarative, provocative. And on the other hand, you might have someone like a Derrida or Levinas who writes quite tangled sentences. And there are these sort of self-interrupting dependent clauses, parenthetical statements, dashes, and so on that make the sentences very tightly interwoven. And it's very difficult to quote out of context, let's say, and sometimes even to explain to somebody else. And so I think that kind of maybe affects the way we have conversations about some of these thinkers, which I think is quite interesting. There's also textual structure, which if we think of maybe the Critique of Pure Reason by Kant on the one hand, and Thousand Plateaus by Deleuze and Guattari on the other, there's a kind of orderliness to Kant and a kind of disorder or chaotic nature to Deleuze and Guattari, where they even say in Thousand Plateaus that they cut and paste sentences from sections and put them into other chapters, and they're kind of this happenstance rearranging of the text, which I think produces some interesting effects. This one has a lot of stuff jammed into it. I was thinking printed form maybe as a category, because we write essays sometimes or journal articles. You have this is a book we're talking about, but it's also a book of a certain length. It's 68 pages. It's quite short, and that I think produces an interesting effect of inviting people to talk about it maybe more easily. There's also the dissertation. So there's these elements of like length, structure, like physical sort of structure, chapters, and so on. Visual style. There's a kind of range here, I think, maybe between like short and independent kind of works, like an essay that stands on its own, versus long and interdependent works that are maybe quite embedded in a tradition, require maybe a lot of background information or reading and so on. And so I thought maybe on the one hand, there's Mao's Little Red Book, which you treat really interestingly in your book as something that's short and could fit in a pocket and could be whipped at somebody's head as an act of protest. And that kind of produces some interesting effects. And on the other hand, maybe something like Being in Time. I know I'm mentioning Heidegger a lot, showing my cards a little bit here, I guess. But it's a huge tome. It kind of requires a certain comfort with dense prose, and it's not really the sort of thing that you bust out in an act of protest. And then last, there's only, oh yeah, sure.
So we have time also to get to other first, but I mean, I love these prompts, Andrew. I mean, and I think that what you're getting at, and I think is something I didn't really think about, but is these more specifics of the material of the aesthetic of theory, right? only insofar as we understand also theory as taking the written form, and that itself is, I think, to some extent, a presupposition that it also is produced not in written form, produced in political life. It can also be produced in music, I think. I read recently Adorno's wonderful book, Philosophy of New Music, and that's one of, as I understand it, one of his major claims is actually that the music he loved, like Schoenberg, is a kind of philosophy, and that the work he's trying to do is to kind of translate tones into terms. And so I think that also we should, I think there's resources to also challenge, to look both at the materiality of the written word, that aspect of theory, but also to challenge that the presupposition that theory always takes the written form as well, which is, it's, I think, a very kind of Euro orientation as well. But thank you, that's actually really wonderful.
Great. Okay, I'm going to spit out a couple more here. I think that's a really excellent point that I hadn't considered. And so I just have a couple more here. I thought the idea of periods or turns, which is maybe a little contested, which I'll sort of dip into in a bit, but you had that great example, which you outlined earlier today, actually, of Althusser, who seems to have these kind of three phases, let's say theoreticist in the early work, Leninist or political in the middle, and maybe we might call it aleatory materialism at the end. And then we might consider tradition or genealogy. And that might range between, on the one hand, like imitation. You know, there's sort of this way of like, Derrida seems to have produced this like lineage of Derridians who really enjoy writing like Derrida, and I get myself guilty sometimes of falling into that, which is kind of interesting. But also there's a kind of let's say inventiveness that you can take in genealogy, where you know maybe Althusser himself reading Marx has a quite inventive reading. Is maybe unusually creative, and that's also very interesting. I also like us to consider maybe this sense of invented genealogy that you raised, which I think is really cool. I quite like this a lot, so I'm going to read this brief quote, just in case this does anything for anybody. And you say that you'll conclude by placing Althusserianism in an invented genealogy, stretching from Korsch through Althusser and his students to Laruelle, as the search for an aesthetic form capable of surpassing the theory-practice dialectic. And that's on page 45. So I like that you kind of, you sort of say, you know, these people, Korsch didn't necessarily like directly influence these thinkers that came afterwards, but you sort of trace this invented genealogy. You see that kind of progression of an idea towards this sort of end. So, so yeah, okay, that's all I kind of really wanted to say. In terms of the quotes and so on. So I'll change my camera back here, but yeah, forgive me for getting a little excited and maybe bowling everyone over with a ton of stuff, but yeah, I'd love to hear about it. You know, if you have any other comments, I take your critical point that I very much presuppose that writing is like the form of theory par excellence, and it's interesting that that's an oversight for me as an artist who's trying to develop a kind of theoretical body of work that involves non-writing, non-written things like music and video. So I'm gonna think a lot more about that. But yeah, if you have anything to say about any of those, I'd very much welcome.
Let me say that. Let me kind of have that percolate, and maybe other people to percolate with that, sure. And point to Curtis, and, sure. And we can have a larger discussion.
Sure, sounds great.
Thanks, Andrew. That was I really liked a lot of the sort of elements that you brought in there, as far as getting to like the sort of formal nitty-gritty of writing as a theoretical practice. It's also something I think about a lot in terms of the kind of implicit legislation that happens in academia, for example, with regards to you know, acceptable theoretical forms. And you know, it's a deep problem, and one that's like deeply institutional, as well as being aesthetic in the kind of like ideal sense of the word. So I think the tendrils of that problematic reach far and wide. Also, of course, thanks to Jonathan for inviting me to do this, and thanks to everybody at New Polis for giving us the space here to sort of, hash out ideas about the relationship between theory and practice, or what doing theory is. I have some sort of more technical questions with regard to Althusser and the relationships that Jonathan sort of brings out in his book. But sort of before I get into the sort of fine grain, maybe while we were speaking and thinking, a quote from Difference and Repetition of Deleuze's Difference and Repetition came to mind in reference to sort of how theory might be thought of other than as a kind of, other than as a kind of magisterium of thought, to quote Rancière's term. So he says at one point something to the effect of, the time is coming when one will no longer be able to write books as one has done for so long. And, it's unclear exactly what he's getting at there, like whether he's referring to the kind of mediatic environment that he sees encroaching, with the relationship between, broadcast media, of television and so on at the time. This is, of course, long before the internet, but nonetheless, these things, start to have their effects on the sort of perceptual zeitgeist, for lack of a better term. So I'm just wondering, in line with this sort of graphocentric understanding of theory, which I'm very much beholden to in some ways, what other forms of theory do we envision today as sort of live possibilities, perhaps? Not just sort of inert possibilities, but things that are sort of on the ground and happening, as it were, whether it's in terms of a popular media that are emerging today, popular forms, popular genres. You mentioned the slogan in your book, as a kind of particularly relevant political form of theoretical practice. But I'm thinking of maybe in some way are memes a form of theory production or something, or other things as well. I think of a few like sort of YouTube content people, like ContraPoints is one person who does a lot of work in relation to theory, as it's understood in the sort of academic context, but being a sort of communicator to non-academic audiences in a way that isn't just trying to fold them into the academic fold, as it were. I don't know. I don't know if there's a question in all of this that I'm saying here, but this is just what was sort of going on in my head as we were talking.
Well, thank you, Curtis, for that. And then, I'd really like to open this up, but I'll just say that again, I think, I do think actually kind of like what we're doing right now, people gathering in virtual space to discuss ideas, that this is, of course, for me, another kind of manifestation of theory. And so I'm also, again, I think that, and I think to just try to maybe link this for a moment to, I know, interests for both for Carl and Roger, and there's an element of how do we decolonize theory? Particularly, and this is important for me, I think, we know that when I went to the Center for Theory, a lot of what I learned, and this is no criticism of teachers that were wonderful, but a lot of what I learned was French theory, which is an entirely North American invention. If we had been in Paris, we would have been studying philosophy. So we have to think about the genealogy of these terms. Why does it get called theory in North America? Because no philosophy department wanted what we do. Very interesting, and not, I would maintain, not for reasons of the better argument, we disagree, blah, 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 blah. A lot of it's politics, a lot of institutional dung that doesn't really rise to the level of intellectual respectability. But there is a function of the theory gets turned. We turn from philosophy to theory so they can live in the humanities minus philosophy. So I'm also cognizant of that, but I also want to then challenge that what got called theory in the 1980s, 1990s was really very French import. And so we have to do the work now, I think, decolonizing it and really, I mean, as much as I love the work of Jacques Rancière and Louis Althusser, they are deeply embedded in a very Euro-Christian orientation about what politics means, about what culture means. And so I think that part of what I want to do is also to say, can we kind of expand our ears and eyes to kind of catch and think about other traditions, including other traditions of thought that come in forms that we haven't, have not been sort of trained to read and to internalize as theory, as knowledge of the world. So that, so yeah, I think that, but within that sphere, I mean, I think, yeah, certainly we should look to other forms, like you say, like the internet and so forth, other forms out there. But also, I was just reading, and then I want to turn this over and I want to plug the mic, but I was just reading Ranesh Guha's, this classic essay by Guha called The Prose of Counterinsurgency, which is an essay that looks at the constitution of the concept of insurgent within the Indian subcontinent during the anti-colonial struggle against the British. And what Guha shows is that insurgency as a concept was marshaled by colonial rule in India, right, to label and dismiss as criminal the attempt to emancipate India. So we have to be, you know, and what I think Guha is so remarkable about is showing that these rather seemingly boring documents by colonial bureaucrats also are theoretical. They are producing a concept. They are producing the concept of the insurgent to demonize, to criminalize resistance to colonial rule. And so, you know, the way he reads, this is to get to the point, he's starting to read, and one of the things he does is to say, you know, he's not looking at written records. So that is, there's no written records for the insurgencies the written records are all from the British standpoint. So he's got to find, as it were, the theory of insurgency, not told from the British side, but told from the side of the resistance. Where does he find those elements? He finds it in things like song. He finds it in poetry. It was passed through networks of resistant fighters and so forth. And so that to me is interesting, that kind of work of like, can you open your ears up? It's like, let's find the knowledge production that didn't get written down because the control over writing was colonized. And so that to me is, I mean, that's a soapbox moment, but read Ranesh Guha for one is my answer to that, but opening up to saying there's this theory out there and there's interesting reasons why it didn't get made into books and statements and so forth. I'll stop there.
And just as the conversation keeps going here, I just want to invite people in the audience to start, you know, populating the chat with questions for any of the presenters. I think Andrew opened up a whole bunch of stuff that we haven't quite gotten to yet, but just to let other people know to feel free to chime in. The way that I generally go about doing this is that I'll invite you to use your own words unless you want me to read out your question in the chat, but the question should be read loud because the chat doesn't show up when we record the video and make the transcript, so it has to be sort of vocalized, which I actually appreciate about Zoom. So Amy West has a question, so maybe we'll start there if that's okay with you guys. Go ahead, Amy.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. Thanks, Jonathan, Andrew, and Curtis. It was a great presentation. And yeah, I just kind of, I had written down some points, Jonathan, that were really similar to what you were just talking about. And I think, yeah, getting at the idea of writing as privileging a certain kind of perspective, namely like the European perspective. And I think we also really should pay attention to the way writing as a medium of theoretical practice reinforces class boundaries, gender boundaries, through a variety of prescriptive norms. Like, you know, we might all have like a really liberal interpretation of grammar, but like we're all prescriptivists when it comes to evaluating a journal article. And when we do that, we're reinforcing a kind of cultural norm, which is, you know, even if you're not from a middle class, upper middle class background, you better write like you are. And even if you're not a native English speaker, you better write like you are. And that very much helped the academy to reinforce the current structure, which is like, you know, white male seeming to be from a privileged background. And I think that's really important to talk about. And the same kind of practice also, I think, Jonathan, is exactly what happens in the colonial structures you were just referencing. You know, when you go through and do like you know, an anthropological study of some of these texts, I think what we would find is a privileging of the European perspective through the kinds of documents that you're talking about. And what ends up happening is we say, well, you know, the more radical or revolutionary texts, which might be published as informal magazines or pamphlets and handed out at bars or, you know, some other places of ill repute, you know, are not counted as legitimate intellectual organizing forces, you know, until the moment at which like power is taken. And that gets me to like my main question, which is, you know, I think we were getting into a lot of interesting territory regarding media and the media of theory. But I would really like you to talk, Jonathan, about the idea of theory as a practice, because, you know, we were talking this weekend about, you know, Frantz Fanon and his role in Algeria. And I think that is essential to thinking about his work. Like, you can't separate Fanon from the Algerian Revolution. Likewise, I know you've been doing some thinking about Walter Rodney and the global South's view of the Russian Revolution. And what's essential there is, of course, the writing, but also what was then done with the writing. And so, yeah, I would love to, it's really less of a question and more of a discussion prompt, but I'd really love to hear you talk about media in a more expansive way, and, you know, and specifically in terms of political action.
Thank you, Amy. Let me just respond to at least one part of that, which is that I'm by no means an expert in the global South political Marxist orientation, but I certainly have tried to learn what I can, and certainly Frantz Fanon is. Somebody recently said about it, if you know Frantz Fanon's work, I mean, I watched a lecture by, I think by Louis Gordon, wonderful philosopher and commentator on Fanon. He said, you know, Fanon is one of those figures who anybody in their mid-30s, you know, who's trying to make theory is going to feel pretty, it's going to feel like they come up pretty short. Because Fanon wrote all of his major texts basically between the ages of 25 and 35, and then said, you know, in so many words, I have other things to do, like make the revolution. But one of the things that I think is also interesting about Fanon's case is the way he's such an incredible writer, at least in my view. And I mean, the aesthetic charge of Fanon's writing is part of its political impact. And I think of the second chapter, famous second chapter of Black Skin, White Masks. He's going to throw you into the moment of being racialized violently in public. And he says, he uses, as a paraphrase, the phrase is being crushed into objecthood. So, I mean, he was very, and interesting, Black Skin, White Masks was Fanon's doctoral dissertation, and it was rejected. And Fanon, because he was brilliant, took 2 weeks and wrote another dissertation and said, screw you, and now I'm going to publish Black Skin, White Masks. But I think that one of the interesting things is also the story of the rejection of Black Skin, White Masks as a doctoral dissertation in psychiatry. It's very interesting in relation to psychiatry and colonialism. But the interesting thing there is that in part what was rejected was they did not, for a variety of reasons, including just racism, colonialism, they didn't, that is, as examiners, didn't recognize that language as fulfilling the expected norms of legitimacy in academic publications. So it's also an example of how, yeah, as you were pointing out, Amy, how academies construct apparatuses of legitimation that also exclude and say, oh, you're not speaking our language, the right language. And so just to touch on that, that's a great point.
I'm not seeing another question there, but there was a comment that Carl said he wanted to ask Jonathan about some stuff. So feel free to keep adding questions to the chat.
Jonathan, I wanted to bring up the whole question of art. Excuse me a second. Sonny, never mind. Sorry, that's my yard person who just showed up the minute I was trying to talk. But
Maybe
my wife's taking care of it. So.
Okay.
Yeah. So I want to ask about the question of art, because I want to make sure that art is not just a trope for theory here, which very often it can be. As somebody who's been very active and very frustrated over the last 15 years, getting involved, because my wife is an artist, getting involved in community art projects, the showing of art, and what might be considered the commodification and incredible neoliberalization of art praxis, particularly as it's taught in the academy with art schools. I mean, it's not insignificant that most art schools that train art are not only very high priced, but they're primarily aimed at plugging people into a very narrow world of art production that can be supported by very wealthy collectors and so forth, which of course you've always had collectors, you've always had that scene throughout the history of art, but it's never been as bad as it is now when you have this explosion of art production, not only in what we would call the normal art world, with art, art groups, local, exhibitions, juried, all the kind of stuff that goes on. But you have the kind of presence of the global South, increasingly in the global North, where a lot of this is expressed as, you might say, a form of emancipation or liberation, but not in a formal theoretical sense. But it's everywhere. I'm just trying to say theory in that sense is pretty much ubiquitous in the contemporary era, particularly if we have, in a sense, the transformation of European cultures and Eurocentric cultures, as this slowly happened in the United States, which also creates political division. So that's a whole another question. At the same time, in terms of the history of art, you have this whole movement in the 1960s and mid-1970s known as conceptual art, which is still around, because my wife and I were, about 5 years ago, we're actually running a gallery in Dallas. We had a bunch of people show up, hey, I'm a conceptual artist. Well, there's always been a lot of kind of, latitude in what it means to call yourself a conceptual attitude, a performance artist, somebody who's just doing, like Duchamp did in 1919, put up a urinal and call it fountain. But there were very well-known figures back in the period like Cothus, Baldwin, Baldessari, et cetera, did conceptual art, which, as I understand, was an effort to, in some ways, from the ground level to make visible what you're talking about. Now, of course, in some ways, this predates the 1960s. It's found in all cultures. One of the points I keep stressing is the fact that you have art in cathedrals from Gothic cathedrals in the Middle Ages was because there was no literacy, and that's basically how stories were told. That's how communication took place. And in other words, if you understand Christian theology as, you know, European theory of 2 millenniums ago, then it is conceptual exactly in the way you're talking about it. But we don't allow the visual or the visible, let alone with the media. I mean, media is a lot more visual. I mean, it goes back to McLuhan, but yet the academic world won't talk about it. Theory is about reading about French theorists. But I see a lot of decolonial theory, and that's kind of, I'd put in a plug for our conference, which will be up on our website, you know, as soon as we get the program together, April 14th and 15th, and possibly the 16th. What you're talking really fits into this kind of analysis and discussion. And but essentially what it is we're challenging the very university itself by which theory is legitimized. So that's just a kind of comment, but I was wondering if there's something you might want to spot about how do we really make theory more visible, not just in a token way, but in a real way? How do we get the art world, which is struggling right now, and there's always people trying to capture it in the apparatus of capture we call neoliberalism and commodification? How do we, in a sense, make that more a part of what we're doing? You know, and again, I speak on my behalf of my wife, who's, you know, tried for a long time to be, you know, a professional artist. She kind of rose in her, you know, within a short period of time. She started in life and so forth. This is just too much nonsense that's going on. But, you know, it's like she's a very visual person, very expressive in visual ways, in ways that I can't. And she's just one of, you know, tens of thousands of people out there like that. But, you know, we don't listen to them. We don't, or better yet, we don't look at them. And so I was wondering if you could talk about art, not as a trope, but art as really as theory.
Okay, thank you so much, Carl. Yeah, so let me just try to pick up on a couple of threads. Those are all very interesting to me. So firstly, I do think that art, as you've made very clear, I think art, giving your example from the, you know, the Gothic era, the paintings in cathedrals. I mean, if we understand that, we might call conceptual art what Joseph Kossuth did in Baldassare in the 1970s, which tends to look like text on a page and pinned to a wall and anti-aesthetic and blah, 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 blah. But in the more broader, capacious sense of a conceptual art, I think you're absolutely right that a mural on a cathedral wall was there to communicate, and it communicates ideas. And if theory is in some measure about ideas and its communication, then we have, I think, with justice to call that conceptual art. We might disagree with it, we might find the ideology offensive, whatever, but it's conceptual. Now, so I think personally, to kind of make the argument that Kossuth does in the 1970s in his essay, Art After Philosophy, which is his kind of manifesto of conceptual art in the 1970s, I love that. My only problem with it is the way it really constrains what philosophy is. Like that when Kossuth says, we're going to make art that's more like philosophy, he has a very particular model of philosophy in mind. And that model, the opening quotes in that essay are A.J. Ayer, Wittgenstein. You know, I don't have any problem with that. I just have a problem with the limit that he puts on what he means by an art of philosophy. And I want to kind of open up that question. The other part of it, though,
I'm not using Kossuth as an example of what we're going. I'm just
as
an illustration. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I totally get that. But it's an important, you know, it's a good illustration. I think I think that artists are involved in the kind of production of ideas. I think that that's certainly true. And I don't want to use it as a trope. So I think in my larger project that spans a couple of books now, I think it's more interesting to get out of this division of labor problem. I experience this very much as a teacher teaching art students. When I first tried to teach theory, a lot of art students kind of rightly rebelled in various ways. The way that students do, they stop reading or whatever it is. But that one of them is to say, you guys make, and I'm this guy called teaching theory, and I'm gonna come in here, and I know you're making these things and getting your hands dirty, but let me tell you what it really means. And at least that's how it got felt by the students. And at that point, theory seems domineering, alienating, monopolizing. And one way of solving that, kind of getting out of the division of labor, is to say, well, the artists themselves are producing ideas. But I think also another interesting move, the one I try to make, is to say, I'm also engaged in a material aesthetic practice. And let's start talking, let's say with my students, let's start talking as material workers who have to deal with the problem of form. Goes to Andrew's point, we have to make questions about form. How are we going to shape this? Whether we're shaping an argument or we're shaping a sculpture. And I try to kind of open that frame up so that we get out of that move where theorists explain and artists make, which I think is a very old, division of labor basically between manual and mental labor. Artists are manual workers in some measure, and the theorists are thinkers. And I think for me, the important figure there is Rancière and getting us into the other thing I don't know if this helps at all, but I think that for me, Rancière's best work is actually when he reads the poetry of workers, when he goes in, when he does that kind of archival work to find the ideas that workers themselves had or gave voice to through poetry, rather than doing this kind of either the elite move of explaining what art is or explaining what politics, so that artists and political subjects can do the work they're supposed to be doing. So to me, it's actually shifted into to think about theory as a kind of aesthetic practice, and then get us out of that division of labor between theorists who think and artists who make.
Yeah,
I don't know if that
can I just add one more thing quickly on that? I mean, the notion of the community of sensibility, which I would really love you to hear you kind of elaborate a little bit on. I know that's not your term, because again, going back to experience I've had with those who actually belong to it. I mean, there are communities of sensibilities. Artists are not just artists. Artists work in all sorts of other contexts, like churches. There's a former master student of mine who's also an art professor at a for-profit art college, who's organized a lot of kind of people in a church-related. It's not necessarily Christian, but people who are doing art more in a kind of religious context and that's kind of thing, that are expressing it different ways. And of course, we're involved with a group that's in Dallas for many years, again, because before it kind of got neoliberalized, in which there was an effort to really take activists who were also doing art and do demonstrations and so forth, again, because of the gentrification of Denver and the high rents and everything, which is another issue in itself. This all got kind of thrown by the wayside and so forth. So, I mean, there is a kind of emancipatory process going on here among the people who represent this broad community of sensibility that is totally being ignored, and is also, in a sense, created a Fanonian sort of double consciousness. I mean, I remember talking to some of these activists then and said, well, we're, the city, the universities don't really consider us artists, we're just activists, who are doing art. And it seems to me, if we're going to really take this notion of making visible seriously, there has to be a theoretical push on we use academics who control that discourse to force people to think differently about this, including our own peers. And I'm wondering how I'm thinking practically, because this is especially important when we're thinking about the decolonial project, because that's how we're going to, in a sense, make what has been hidden for so long, what has been lost, which has been stereotyped, which has been marginalized, make it visible and make it recognized. And if we don't do that as theorists along the lines you're talking, rather than just giving it lip service, it will continue to be colonized, which means commodified in some ways. I mean, academic journals are the most, and I don't want to get me off on academic journals. When we started electronic publishing in the early 2000s, we were ahead of the time. What happened was the big international publishers, the one that used subsidy publish, moved in, took over a lot of the journals. That's why you have these paywalls. But what's happened in the academic world is now it is paywalled paywall journals that are considered to be the most prestigious, and this is what you have to publish in to get tenure and so forth. Having been on the editorial board of these journals, I can say that is absolute crap and garbage. They're no better. It has created this perception, again, because of the control of the neoliberalized higher education system that prevents this kind of conversation. You know, it's like if you're not in a paywall journal, you're not really speaking with authority. And that's what we have to force and push back against. That's why we've created the new polis.
I'm not going to get to Curtis's question, but
you got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Curtis had a question. Just wanted to point that out.
I'm sorry, shut up now.
But no, thank you, Carl, because I think just to answer to one point on that, this I think was also true in what Amy said as well, which is that, you know, I think we have a responsibility as academics to really push back against the paywalling of our knowledge production. And I would say, you know, the knowledge production is collective. This is always a problem in capitalism. I hold that the knowledge production is collective. I haven't read a single academic paper worth its salt that doesn't have citations from lots of other people. That meant its origin is collective. It should not be, in my view, it should not be monopolized, singularized, paywalled out. But that's unfortunately how capitalism works, right? It's like collective labor is then monopolized, and so I think, you know, I appreciate the work the New Polis does, and other outside, inside academic work, academic publishing venues that are really trying to make a case for saying, what is the purpose of knowledge production if one person, maybe just the author, reads it? I mean, you know, and I think also then drawing attention to, in our capacity as academics, in my capacity as a teacher, I think it's really important. For example, I teach art history nominally. Now, I have a set of courses I have to teach. But I was recently in conversation with somebody at another university, and this interesting conversation came up where we started saying, you know, what if, and it's certainly being done, so it's not hypothetical, but what if we begin to think about using all of the resources, the disciplinary resources that art history has, the analysis of imagery, cross-cultural comparative work, and so forth. What if we use that to not only address the things that we find in museums, public art, murals, the art of the anonymous, posters, speeches, protest paraphernalia. I mean, we can teach whole classes on those objects using all those rich resources we have in art history. We don't have to say our subject matter is limited to the contents of the major museums. Okay, I want to go to Curtis's question in relation to the relation between art and theory. As I understand it, does this dislodge the pretensions to knowledge of theory? And if so, is the distinction between knowledge and non-knowledge an important one? If so, how do we understand this in a pluralist decolonial project without resorting to background norms of a hegemonic culture? So I'd like this idea, yeah, of if Althusser, as well, again, if Althusser says art can reflect society, doesn't produce any knowledge of it, and that's the duty of theory. Well, if theory turns out to be, in part, the aesthetic work of the making visible, you know, my claim in the book is that, in fact, I think that if, in part, the beginning of critique is the making visible of a problem that we perhaps didn't know was a problem, then we have to say that art does provide a kind of knowledge. So I hope that that sort of challenges that pretension of theory to be have the monopoly on the knowledge side of the equation. I also think that this idea of knowledge, non-knowledge is interesting. Andrew had mentioned earlier about, you know, this sort of thought experiment. People go into a gallery, they go into a museum. Hopefully they don't ask for, are you qualified to look at this very difficult art or whatever. And conceiving of viewership in that more democratic sense, I think is important. I also think that I'm actually interested in those moments, to get to your question, imagine those moments where people say, I don't get it in the museum, and they often feel bad about it. They feel like they've done something wrong, they didn't do their homework, they suddenly feel cut off, alienated, and they say, you know, this is why I don't go to museums. because I don't speak the language, and the whole thing. And I want to sort of hold on to saying that, like, maybe that moment of saying, I don't get it, let's sort of like credit that a bit more. Let's open that up and not say, well, unfortunately, you didn't take upper division art history classes, so sorry. I mean, let's kind of credit that moment. And I can sort of identify with that moment. That's how I began with theory. I don't get it. And the I don't get it turned out to be a kind of pleasure. So I think we have to kind of, open those questions up about what do we mean by knowledge? Maybe the I don't get it moment is also itself a kind of knowledge moment that doesn't get marked as such. So I don't know if that helps, but that's an experience I have very much as a teacher. The I don't get it should be the beginning of something, not like, wow, you've admitted your idiocy, and so we're not going to have the conversation.
Curtis, your hand is up. Did you want to comment more on that?
Unless, I mean, if other people have things to move on to, I'm happy to just move on. But otherwise, yeah, I had a few thoughts there. In hearing your response, and that I don't get it moment of, one's initiation into a certain kind of, spectatorship in art, whether it's visual art or any other kind. And I would say also that that moment is also largely, the aesthetic moment of initiation into theoretical practice, at least at a certain point. And that the not getting it, becomes a kind of, aesthetic fuel for understanding things more deeply, perhaps. But it also reminded me of, Roger was talking about Schoenberg in California before we all started. And there's this quote from Schoenberg where he says, he has a certain model of the avant-garde that like sort of acts implicitly in what he does, in the sense that he sees the avant-garde as being avant-garde in the sort of strict sense of the term, in which they're sort of ahead of their time. And eventually sort of, ordinary, normal culture, whatever that means, will catch up, or something to that effect. But I was watching an interview with Steve Reich, who I know you're a big fan of, John, when he says that Schoenberg is just wrong about, so Schoenberg said that, in 40 or 50 years, they'll be humming my tunes like they hum Beethoven and Mozart or whatever. And Steve Reich says, that's just not right. Like, no one is ever going to be humming a 12-tone composition. And it's not because it doesn't have aesthetic value. That's not the function it plays in society in a certain respect, right? So that's also a big problem to me that I think about a lot. In the same way that I think, no one's ever going to be humming, the theory of ideas and Deleuze's difference in repetition in the same way that they hum I think therefore that I am in Descartes or something. Thoughts there. I don't know where I'm going with that. It's just an interesting little.
Andrew, Andrew says you have a question when Curtis is done. Did you want to wrap into that, or did you want to?
Oh, I think if Jonathan or anyone wants to respond more directly to Curtis, I'm not totally sure if what I'm saying loops in there, so I'd invite anyone else to speak before I jump in.
I did just want to say that since Curtis brought up the idea of the avant-garde and the theory of the avant-garde, that I think that there's a violence. The metaphor of the avant-garde is always violent. And I probably because we were talking about Adorno before we started recording, and I did earlier work, and I play sometimes jazz music. I was thinking of my dear friend Ron Miles, who has a really great, I'm not just plugging Ron because he's my friend, album called Rainbow Sign, which is critically acclaimed right now. And we talk about this all the time. But in avant-garde jazz of the 60s, right, there's a kind of theoretical apparatus that comes in and wants to claim that for Marxism. They call it the October Revolution in jazz. And people like Charles Mingus, it just irritates the hell out of Charles Mingus, and he's like writing up a storm in the jazz journals at the time. So there's this debate going on at the beginning of the 60s. Charlie Parker's died. Who's going to be the next Charlie Parker? All of this sort of stuff. And so Mingus gets together with Duke Ellington, who's like from the older set. And he's like, we're going to make the most far out record ever. And it's going to be freer than free. And Duke Ellington's response to Mingus is just like, well, let's not go back that far. Let's go this, because he's got this whole sophistication and what sophistication means in urban African-American culture. The idea of sophisticated lady and all of this stuff that comes out of the 20s. The disruption that the kind of white jazz theorists, and I'm thinking of Frank Kofsky in particular, is they want this kind of forward-thinking thing, and Ellington has kind of a forward-thinking thing, but African-American modernism is not the same thing as Duchamp and this other stuff. So I just wanted to kind of throw that in there because it was rattling in my mind. What is this question of the avant-garde? Obviously, Adorno misreads jazz, and that becomes a part of this whole discussion as well. Maybe I'll turn it back to Andrew, because I know that you're a musician too, Andrew, and so that gives you a chance. But Andrew is frozen, maybe? Oh, there you are.
I think he may not have heard you, because maybe there's a connection issue.
I lost the last like 10.
Oh yeah, I was making a connection between jazz but also music, because I know you're doing music, so I wanted to give you a lead in there. So
yeah, gosh, I have a whole bunch of things kind of rattling around in my head, and I'm not sure exactly where to start. I'm really fascinated by your point about Mingus sort of resisting this like appropriation or interpretation by a school of thought. I think it's really neat, and I'm actually so shocked to hear that Mingus was like writing up a storm in journals. Like, I don't know that I knew that Mingus had a body of written work, and I find that really interesting. That like, why is it that I'm familiar with like Adorno's writing on jazz, but I didn't know that jazz musicians were writing at all? I think that's like a really interesting question. I had a couple of questions, or a kind of, I don't know. I had a question that I'm just kind of bandying about in my head that I don't know how to answer, and I thought I would just sort of toss it out and hope somebody else has some thoughts on it, which is like, if we blow open theory in this radical way, where maybe now music can be theoretical and political pamphlets are theoretical and poetry and so on, visual art is theoretical. I'm like both really energized by that. I'm really emboldened by that. I think it feels just, like it feels right and good. And at the same time, I have this like weird spooky feeling that like, is there a risk of that we're gonna like lose something important here? Is there now no such thing as non-theory? I don't know, is there's like something we might want to hold on to in the word theory? Because, and I'm thinking about, I'll sort of, throw out an example here to kind of like try to make this maybe more concrete. I'm thinking, I wonder, Jonathan, if you'd be interested in speaking at all to the Little Red Book and May 68 in France and that kind of protest culture that emerged there, which I think is just so, sometimes I'm like annoyed with Badu for like banging on that drum for so long, and like I sort of feel like, oh, get over it. It was 50 years ago, and like I don't know that I care anymore. But at the same time, I'm also like kind of thrilled by moments like that, and I do really want to think about it and get more into it. And I think about this moment of like the Little Red Book being like wielded as a weapon of protest, like being like whipped at somebody's head in a lecture hall. And on the one hand, I feel this sense of like, yeah, that's like so thrilling, to like involve like a book and like a set of ideas in this like concrete material practice, and like I hope nobody actually got hurt, but it seems like it's a little book. It seems like a kind of symbolic gesture more than a violent one. But at the same time, I also have this concern of like, wait, can't we just like talk about our ideas? What are we doing here? Is this like really the road we want to go down? And some of the like polemical stuff that comes out of Badiou and Bedouins, frankly, I find really kind of repulsive sometimes. I don't know that we're enriched in even like in grad school by the presence of those kind of attitudes that sometimes emerge from that. So like, I'm kind of wondering, like, is there non-theory, like, or is there bad ways of doing theory that we're like losing the ability to gain critical purchase on if we blow open this concept in this way?
I think this question's great, Andrew, and that probably is a kind of lacuna in my larger project, which is that, you know, if everything kind of seems like it's becoming theory, then are we losing that specificity? And I think I also, and this might be a little bit of a trapdoor get out clause for me, but I also think that one of the things I find interesting about theory is precisely that part of the history of theory as I've read it or inherited it has also been the struggle over what we mean by this. And so I guess one consequence is, you know, maybe everything is, well, but that's itself a kind of theory. Like, well, theory is everything. That's itself a kind of theory. So to me, I'm interested in this kind of idea of theory as a kind of, hopefully a kind of continually unsettling term that doesn't live in particular departments, that its definition is contested. Even in Althusser, 3 major periods, 3 different theories of theoretical practice. So there's something about theory that gives rise to the crisis of what we mean by it. I find that actually a strategic moment. It's interesting to me. I was thinking, as you were speaking too, a similar problem that came up in class with students the other day. We read Judith Butler's landmark essay on imitation, gender, and subordination. And what she says something interesting about the concept or the term lesbian in that text. And she says, I would like to keep this term permanently. I would like to keep it, she's like, she said something like, I'm willing to stand under the sign of lesbian in certain political contexts, but I also want to keep it permanently unsettled, precisely what that signifies. And I love that kind of move. She likes to let's keep opening it up, troubling her in their terms. Like the trouble of it is partly what's interesting about it. So there's that. I also wanted to dial back into the Schoenberg, Mingus. One I agree with Andrew too. It's interesting that, you know, we have to remember that musicians, artists themselves have entered the theoretical terrain. They've made claims about music and counterclaims against theorists. Other thing I think is interesting, and here my model is Walter Benjamin. There's often this move that theory speaks in this neutral scientific philosophical language and explains what art is. The other move is to say, like, is there kind of a philosophy, as it were, in jazz composition that itself could be adopted in philosophical or theoretical work? I look at someone like Benjamin, his essays on surrealism and many other essays, you know, One Way Street, for example, where rather than giving us a theory of surrealism, he gives us a surrealist philosophy precisely because he thinks that those techniques in surrealism enable him to think about interesting juxtapositions that are relevant for modern life. So it's not for him like to say, you know, like an art historian, like, let me give you a theory of what surrealism is and explain it to you, but rather let me use surrealism as a kind of method actually to talk about things like politics and society. And so I like that move too. Not a philosophy of art, but a kind of, you know, is there not a philosophy of jazz, but also like a jazz approach to composing philosophy? And that I think is an interesting project.
Yeah, and to jump back on that, I think I'm very much interested in this conversation about theory itself too, because even within the academy, for those of you who aren't affiliated with universities, there's a real allergy to theory, as Jonathan is alluding in terms of interdepartmental stuff, and there's in that allergy to theory, there's this kind of language of elitism, like, oh, well, that's just elitists want to talk about French people. But that kind of position doesn't allow us to consider some of what I think are the most critical theorists right now. So someone like Liam Bedasamosake Simpson, who's Nishnabeg, and or Gerald Weisner, indigenous theorists that are not rejecting the idea that theory is this elite thing, but saying that Nishnabeg people do theory better, or that Glenshon Coulthard in Redskin White Masks, which is of course a reference to Fanon in the title, is rehabilitating Marx, and he's not doing it in this way where you need to like come in and give like a 200-year diatribe on the Euro-Western or Euro-Christian genealogy of what Marx is. He's just saying like he has this theory of primitive accumulation or prior accumulation that's useful, but it's flawed, and this is what we need to do with it. But within the academy, because there's this like, oh well, theory is only for graduate students. It's like for my friends of color, as Pink Tinker would say, like, yeah, now that we've had post-colonial studies, now that we've had these people of color enter the university, we've had gender studies come in, it's really quite ironic that that's the moment where everybody becomes allergic to theory, is when these diverse voices do come in. And then we say, oh no, theory is just about white men and we got to get rid of white men or something.
I just totally resonate with that, Roger. I mean, I think that, that sort of easy discourse of saying theory's elitist, we don't need it, exactly as you're right, at the moment in which all these voices are bringing to bear and saying, we have theory, we're involved in these kinds of questions too. It reminds me, just one thing comes on, it reminds me of the interesting feminist critique of the death of the author thesis out of Bar. The very moment in which, at the moment of second wave feminism, where feminist scholars are saying, we need to start opening up the canon and reading the work of women. And then Bar, interestingly, it's at that moment that suddenly gets canonized. Well, we don't need to talk about authors anymore. That's a similar kind of formal analogy to, I think, that problem you're addressing there. And another thing comes to mind, and Amy had mentioned this too, mentioned figures like Walter Rodney. I mean, one of the things, I mean, I've read a lot of Walter Rodney this past summer. And if you haven't read him, I'd really encourage you to. I mean, Rodney's perspective as a kind of global, oriented from a global South position, but also wanting to engage. I think his lectures on the Russian Revolution, his book on the Russian Revolution is fascinating because he's asking the question, I'm interested in the legacy of Leninism too. I just want to understand that or frame that in light of what it's meant for the global South. What did the Russian Revolution mean from that perspective? So I think, there's also this, I'm all on board with saying, if theory is just French and elitist, we don't need more of that. But if in getting rid of that, we also silence all these other voices, then that's really a problem.
I feel like my creative writing friends, so if for those of you on the new post, we do have literary conversations as well as critical conversations. I've just been buried in other work, and so I invite other people to contribute. But there was a conversation with Silas Adderstrom and Stephen Dunn, two novelists, last summer that we did on the New Polis, and I was talking about the theory of tragedy, and they were talking about how they work against that, and the whole anti-humanism thing all comes out, but they're contemporary small press writers who are doing this theoretical work in their writing, but not being recognized for it in the university and not being recognized for it in the broader apparatus of big press literary production in the US. And it goes for poetry as well as prose, but there's one on with poets as well. Or contemporary jazz musicians who are doing all of this spiritual jazz stuff, even on the Kendrick Lamar's record, with reaching back to the avant-garde and reimagining what that might be right now. That's happening, but I feel like because there's been such a distaste or an allergy to theory, that it becomes really difficult to be having even the conversations about the stuff that's coming out because
I think to your point,
go ahead.
Roger, that also the allergy to theory is certainly something I have wonderful colleagues, but in my longer career, I mean, it's always, it's a kind of lightning rod word at times in conversations. And I think I think even in the heyday of high theory, we don't use that term anymore, but that was sort of French theory, 70s and 80s, 90s. Then too, there were a lot of, frankly, English literature departments who said, we don't want this. And behind the kind of rhetoric of, we just need to study history and, was really, we don't want that because it's not American. It was a lot of anti-theoretical discourse that was really about, this is a foreign import. And that, I think that version of the anti-theoretical orientation is just intensified when it's like indigenous theorists, people of color broadly, the global South, I think you still have a version of that, like, we don't need those foreign imports into our North American discipline. So I think that's an important element of that.
Other questions or folks who haven't talked? Or I can see Amy on my screen because she was nodding, so I don't know if you want to jump back in either, Amy.
I would love to hear from some other women in the session, though, instead of just me. I see some other names, and I think there's a lot we can contribute. So I will say that.
Can I play professor and call on somebody I know? Kieran, are you here?
Yes, but I came in late due to the time change. In Germany, we haven't changed our clocks, and you have, so I missed the whole lecture. I'm just listening in. I'll have to catch it on YouTube later.
Okay, well, we're not talking about anybody specific. Amy, could you kind of, Kieran has actually been one of our respondents in previous critical conversations. So, and she's a star theorist from undergraduate days in our university. So she might have something interesting to say if you want to frame a question with her.
Well, Kieran, you have been doing a lot of work with women in religion, I've noticed lately from our different stuff. So to answer, I think Amy's question is broadly about women's role in theory, but also in a very contemporary moment of doing the work we call theory.
Just a short response. Once again, I'm just speaking as for no reason here, just because I'm a woman. But as a response to this theory discussion, I think it's quite interesting, what you raised, Roger, and then someone, was it Jonathan Fardy who said it? Someone else about that this allergy to theory coincides with indigenous people, women, people of color finally entering the academy. And I think that I had never thought of it that way before. I don't know if you can say that there's some kind of mass conspiracy around that, but I think it is an interesting thing to be in the academy. Maybe I missed the first half of the discussion. So when we talk about theory, we can also say, like, theorize about what theory is, but we're getting so meta. Is it philosophy? Is it critical theory? What is it? But what in the academy would make the academy allergic to thought, right? It seems like kind of an absurd thing, because I think theory, I think you can define it broadly as thought. And is it really a tool to silence people, or or is it really just a prejudice thinking that, is it a self-fulfilling prophecy that theory is for white men, right? Because people just keep saying that it's for rich white men, and so it propagates itself. I think it's quite an anti-intellectualism that's just fractured and directed at everybody, and quite unhelpful from what you're describing. That's just some initial thoughts.
Yeah, I would actually say that it's a great point, that, I agree that I think theory in the broadest sense is thought. And I think in that sense, I think it's interesting. I don't know how it is in Germany, but in my experience in the US, there's often a privileging in pedagogical discourse of, we want students to do critical thinking. They privilege that. But theory as a kind of troubling set of questions that raises political questions, social questions, that there can be often, in my experience, the kind of allergic reaction to. So, there's sort of like the institutionalization of like the 101 course in critical thinking, but a kind of allergic reaction to like talking about, race, racism, colonialism. Even in like the last U.S. presidency, I won't name that man, but there was this whole attack on the teaching of history. That was part of his late period of his presidency. That was part of his political platform, was we got to stop teaching, things like slavery. We should teach like American greatness or whatever it was. But there was a concerted attack on anything that was critical, interrogative, that dealt with political catastrophe, white supremacy. And all of that got linked up to like in the buzzword of like, we don't need any more of this teaching of critical race theory. That was just all over that attack on the teaching of the history of things like slavery and colonialism.
Yeah, I think that allergy can come from different places. Of course, from the last president, that's different than an academic thing. And I think there might be something a bit like almost like banal about it. Like some people are just protecting their disciplines, like as you had spoken about in literary theory. I recently came across some debates around people saying like, are linguistic skills, are multiple languages important to be familiar with in philosophy? And I think that depends on what kind of language you do. But I witnessed some scholars saying, no, this is more like analytic philosophers, like, no, you only need to speak one language to do philosophy. Yeah, maybe in some cases, but maybe that's just like a bit of a way of protecting your career too. So that's a bit different than the Trump thing, which was very much a politically motivated thing. But maybe some people don't want to talk about theory just because they don't want to, right? Like they want to defend their expertise, their realm of expertise.
Excuse me. I'm wondering if we could. This is a good conversation here. I would like to have a conversation about something related based on what we've said. And I'd like everybody to stay, but I want to stop the recording since it looks like in terms of the actual flow of questions here, we don't want to put Kieran totally on the spot just to keep the conversation going. So I'm going to stop the recording right now. And if you could all stay on for about 5 more minutes, please, because I have something I didn't think of before we started this, but now I would really like to pose it, but it's unrelated to the theoretical discussion we're having right now. It's more practical and follow-up. So thanks.